All right, well, welcome everyone. We may still have some friends that walk in, but I figure we'll get started, and we do have lunch for everyone downstairs afterward. Thank you, honey. So once again, we welcome Amanda Tyler, the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee, to come and make your presentation, and hopefully, you may have questions or comments too that you would like to share as we explore this critical concept of religious freedom in our country. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks to all of you who are here in the room and those on live stream as well. I do have a presentation. I will try to go through this in about 40 minutes probably, and then leave time for questions, which is honestly my favorite part of any presentation. So that's it. So if I could just ask if you hold your questions till the end, because some of them might be answered through the presentation as well. And thank you for advancing the slides. So I want to say a brief word first, and I have QR codes on some of these slides, so if you have a phone, if you just point your phone at the QR code, you should be able to pull up a website that you could look at now or later if you're interested in any of this. A very brief word about Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the organization that I lead, founded in 1936, and it was originally founded it's called Baptist Joint Committee because it was a joint project of the major denominations at the time, which were the Northern Baptist churches, now the American Baptist churches, Southern Baptist churches, and National Baptist Convention, which of course is the predominantly Black Baptist denomination. So in 1936, for these three very different kinds of Baptists to get together was a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself. And their work was focused on this Baptist idea of religious freedom for all people. And that we believe that is best expressed in our constitutional democracy by advocating for the separation of church and state. I understand you all have been going through a Baptist history, so I'm not going to go all the way back, but you know that it is very much in the Baptist DNA to care about religious freedom for all people. And it comes out of our understanding of soul liberty, of this idea that each person is responsible for their own relationship with God, and that no other person, no matter how powerful, should come between that person. And that's the reason that Baptists, again, from the very beginning in the early 17th century, we have advocated as much for people from other other religions and even atheists as we do for Baptists. Because we believe that for faith to be authentic, it has to be freely chosen. That in order to say yes to God, we have to have the ability to say no to God, and that government-sponsored religion interferes with that idea. Of course, one of our Baptist forebears is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I quoted this in the sermon today as well, but I think it bears repeating. The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. And what I think Dr. King is speaking to here is this healthiest relationship between the institutions of religion and government, and that is a healthy separation between the two. That independence is crucial, not just for the state, but also for the church and its witness in our society. So I mentioned BJC has been around for nearly 90 years now, but on the next slide, I want to speak a little bit about this campaign that we started back in 2019. It's called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and it was really out of increasing violence in our society, and especially violence at houses of worship. At Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, in the violence in Charlottesville with the Unite the Right rally, and then, of course, the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, that we saw that these violent extremists were not just armed with deadly weapons, but also with a deadly ideology of Christian nationalism. And we felt a real calling for the need to better understand what Christian nationalism is. We were inspired by the words of James Baldwin, who once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced." And so we felt a real need to face head on what the dangers of Christian nationalism are. Part of that is just having some definitions to understand exactly what this ideology is and how it's causing harm in our society. So the next slide, I want to start with a definition of religious nationalism. Religious nationalism generally is a fusion of religious and national identities, and it's a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. I think in the Christian context, I would date Christian nationalism at least back to the time of Constantine. That was a long time ago. That was, when the power of the empire took on Christianity as an official religion and then used the power of empire to enforce it on others. And Constantine was in the 4th century. So a long, long time ago. And then we have, centuries of oppression and violence, often done in the name of Christianity. Of course, the Crusades, Inquisitions, the doctrine of discovery, which used this deadly heresy of white supremacy to justify the stealing of native land. Then, of course, slavery and segregation. But it's also, religious nationalism is not unique to the United States. It's in a lot of different religious contexts, a lot of different national contexts around the world. But for most of the conversation today, I'm not oblivious to the global connections, but I want to focus in on Christian nationalism in the US context. And so on the next slide, the definition of Christian nationalism that we use at the campaign, and this QR code goes to our materials at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. And Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. Put another way, Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, that one has to be a Christian. And really not just any kind of Christian, but a Christian who espouses certain theological beliefs that are in line with policies of the state. Right, and that is an official kind of Christianity, and that's the only way to be fully American. On the next slide, we also have to understand how Christian nationalism overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And again, in the American context, white Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging, of who really belongs here, that is limited to the people who were included in full citizenship rights at the founding of the country, which was really a very narrow group of people. White Protestant men who owned property. Those were the people who fully belonged at the beginning of the country. And white Christian nationalism continues to tell the story that those really are the people who are most American and who are most deserving of full rights, and everyone else has some kind of second-class citizenship. Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism is not new. I said Constantine earlier, but there are other examples, of course, of white Christian nationalism throughout our history. I think about it as kind of high tides of white Christian nationalism. There are times in our history that have a more pronounced effect. And one of those times was in the early 20th century when the KKK was at its largest and most influential. And of course, the KKK has this toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence. It was not just anti-Black, but also anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic, and it used a perversion of Christianity to justify its terrorism and violence. And so that is kind of a precursor in some ways to some of the same themes that we see coming up in our current context. On the next slide, I want to talk some about some of these markers of Christian nationalism. One of them is a heavy reliance on a mythological founding of the United States as a quote-unquote Christian nation. And that is not meant in a descriptive or a demographic sense, right? It's true that a majority of Americans, it's a declining majority, but still a majority, continue to identify as Christian. But when people say America is a Christian nation, they really mean it was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. There's a level of God's providence, this idea that God's providential hand is guiding America through history, and that God blesses everything that's happened. We hear it in every political speech, God bless America. That is, I think, a soft form, a rhetorical form of Christian nationalism. But this idea that the fate of the United States, the political decisions, are in line with God's will for the world. That is, I think, one of these markers of Christian nationalism. But the problem, of course, is that not only does that go against some of these founding ideals of religious freedom in this country, the idea that one's religion does not define one's belonging or citizenship in the United States, but from a Christian theological view, it also goes against the gospel. John's gospel, for God so loved the world. It doesn't say for God so loved the United States. And of course, I know that when John was writing, there was no United States, but that's the point, right? That God's love transcends national boundaries, and that God does not love the United States best of all. God loves the entire world. Christian nationalism is also kind of an exaggerated form of American exceptionalism or civil religion. On the next slide, I want to talk about how we understand Christian nationalism in relation to Christianity. Christian nationalism is a form of idolatry because it tries to merge, again, political and religious authority into one. It replaces the gospel of love with this false idol of power. It is also a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. As we talked about this morning, Jesus was always on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed and the poor. Jesus never aligned himself with the earthly powers. In fact, Jesus was executed by the earthly powers, in part for speaking truth to power, and was really about upsetting and disturbing the power structures of the world as it is. But Christian nationalism uses Jesus, and often a light-skinned white Jesus, as a mascot for Christian nationalism. That using Jesus' name and Jesus' image to try to bless the ideas of Christian nationalism. And because it uses language and symbols of Christianity, to a casual observer, it looks a lot like the same thing. And this is where I think, especially for Christians, we have to be very honest about the ways that, as much as we'd like to say that Christian nationalism has nothing to do with American Christianity, history doesn't allow us to get off the hook. Because for centuries, again, our theology has been infected by different versions of Christian nationalism. We have inherited a religion that has been poisoned by Christian nationalism. And it doesn't mean, again, that has driven us further and further away from the core message of the gospel and the teachings of Jesus. And so, a very brief kind of history of Christian nationalism can kind of see some of these inflection points. I started with the doctrine of discovery, the very founding of the taking of the land that would lead to the founding of the country was based on a deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to steal land and murder the native inhabitants of North and South America. And then once the empire was being set up here, and of course it was based on slavery, it was the Anglican Church that would let its theology be violated and used in order to further slavery. In 1667, the assembly in the colony of Virginia was composed entirely of white Anglican men. Of course, at the time in Virginia, in order to be a citizen, you had to be a member of the Anglican Church. Like, religious and national identities were completely entwined. This was an example of Christian nationalism then. Well, that Anglican assembly passed a law that said that baptism would not free an enslaved Native American, person of African descent, or mixed race background. This is a really stark example of a theology being completely compromised in subservience to the policy of the state, which was to have an enslaved population, and that even the freedom of baptism would be subjugated to the slavery of the state. The fact that there are Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists is also an example of Christian nationalism because, of course, white Baptists in the South chose power over love when they created the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. They claimed that slavery was, quote, an institution of heaven. And then again in 1863, the Southern Baptist Convention pledged to support the Confederacy in the Civil War. It was this same false gospel that was used to justify Jim Crow segregation and lynching, with church members often members of the KKK as well. And so when we think about the threat of Christian nationalism today and what our calling is as Christians to do something about it, I think part of it is really reckoning with the way that the faith has been corrupted by Christian nationalism. How can we both tell the truth about this history, but also really work to reclaim a theology that is more in line with the teachings of Jesus? And then the work for all of us, regardless of religious identity, if we are Americans, is to understand what our patriotic duties are in calling out Christian nationalism. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. I think that definitions are helpful here. So I'm going to define patriotism as a love of country. Like all other love, it cannot be forced. It has to be freely chosen. So one isn't required to be patriotic. But many people are, and many people who do sense a love of country can express that love of country in a number of different ways. Some of them are symbolic and use, flags and different, reciting the pledge and doing some of these other markers of patriotism, but others are more expressive, like expressing our First Amendment rights, including freedom of speech and freedom of religion. We can love our country so much that we actually want better for it. And I think those are examples of a healthy sense of patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that demands supremacy over all other allegiances, including, if we are Christians, allegiances to Jesus. And so I think a way to help tell the difference between the two is to ask ourselves, is my sense of patriotism asking me to go against some of my core religious convictions? If so, then I don't think it's a healthy sense of love of country or patriotism. I think it's this unhealthy and destructive nationalism. And so part of our work, I think, is to really work to tell the difference between the two, not sacrificing an identity we might have as a patriotic American, but thinking about that as distinct and separate from whatever religious identity that we might hold. So Christian nationalism, very old idea, very old iterations, relatively new term. And one thing that has been happening over the last couple of years, in the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about how Christian nationalism is measured by social scientists and researchers. How can we compare and see how much Christian nationalism really is in our culture? So I want to speak first a little bit to the methodology. So when researchers are trying to study this, they don't ask people, are you a Christian nationalist? Check yes or no, for a number of different reasons. But rather, they ask questions that get to some of those markers of Christian nationalism that I spoke to earlier. They have different questions, and this slide shows some of the questions that are used that you can see are kind of a parallel to those markers, that the federal government should declare the United States to be a Christian nation, that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. You can hear some of those echoes of providence, God's providence there, or that the federal government should advocate for Christian values. And I know this question's popping in a lot of people's mind, like, what's wrong with that, right? Like, if I want to have, the value, Christian love and generosity and hospitality, what's wrong with having those values advocated? I'll say that these are just 3 questions. They ask 6. And so you have to agree with all of the questions in order to be at the far end of the Christian nationalism scale. There is necessarily nuance in the way that people approach these. And I think that that's appropriate. I think sometimes in our conversations, we lack a sense of the complexity of people, especially when it comes to ideology. And so that is one point I want to make here. So on the next slide, And these questions, and this first slide is taken from the work of Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. They wrote a book in 2020 called Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Really helpful kind of landmark work on Christian nationalism. This particular data is a little old, but I share it, and I'm going to share some updated data in a moment, because I think the trends are helpful for us to see. First of all, you'll see there is no category of Christian nationalist, not Christian nationalist, okay? And that's because it's an ideology. It's not an immutable characteristic, right? And so it's this idea that we all have an opportunity every single day to embrace or reject Christian nationalism. There's movement along a scale of Christian nationalism. And so they've divided it into 4 categories: rejectors, resistors, accommodators, and ambassadors. So ambassadors are people who fully agree with all of the statements that are showing a marking of Christian nationalism. Rejectors are people who totally disagree with all of them. And the others, the resistors and the accommodators, are somewhere in the middle. A few things to point out. The smallest group of people are the ambassadors. That might actually be a little surprising when we talk about a rising tide of Christian nationalism. But the problem is that the smallest group of people, those who most embrace Christian nationalism, have an inordinate amount of power. This is also how Christian nationalism is anti-democratic. That actually it's not representing a majority view of Americans, even though it is a majority view on the federal level, but also in many state governments as well. And so we see that this is kind of out of whack right now. The biggest group are those in the middle, either the resistors or the accommodators. And I think that helps us explain why Christian nationalism has been such a hard thing to get over as a country, right? How this is such a pervasive ideology that we have never fully been able to get rid of in this country. And it's because we have the most people who are just kind of either just resisting or just accommodating this ideology, but not moving fully to rejecting it. The next slide shows some updated numbers from PRRI, which is a very respected religion research organization based in Washington, D.C. These numbers are from a large study they did in 2023. They've updated, and I think they're actually coming out with some updated numbers this week. So you can go to prri.org and see kind of where their numbers are right now. But again, they use a similar questions, similar scale. But you'll notice that adherents, which are those who most embrace it, are actually even smaller in their survey, just 10%. And when you add the adherents and the sympathizers together, those are people that some might say, okay, where's the Christian nationalist population? It's about 30% of America, right? So that's a distinct minority when you think 70% are either skeptical or rejecting it. I think that is encouraging news that we need to really understand again, and that's why there is this disconnect between those who hold power and what the majority of people in the country actually think when it comes to Christian nationalism. Very similar questions. So that is actually the one different question, and I think this shows why you see this kind of big drop in numbers. There's a question on the survey about that Christians should exercise dominion in all areas of society, which is reflective of one of the most extreme iterations of Christian nationalism, which is called dominionism, or sometimes Seven Mountains Mandate, sometimes called New Apostolic Reformation. This is like the most extreme, or one of the most extreme iterations of Christian nationalism. So to be an adherent in this survey, you have to agree with that statement. So I think what we see here is, though Christian nationalism is still a minority view, those who hold it have very extreme views of what Christian nationalism and how the role that religion plays with government, and again, a very particular kind of religion. On the next slide, this is again from PRRI. I know it's very hard to see on this slide, so I'll kind of interpret it for you so you can see the trends. So keep in mind that 30% I said, those are the 30% are the adherents or the sympathizers to Christian nationalism. If you think of that as a national average, The states on this map that are some shade of blue are over 30%. Those are the states where you have more than 30% who are in those categories. If it's kind of a shade of green, that's under. Connecticut is green, 22%. Not that much under the national average, but definitely under the national average. What's interesting, there are only, I think in this survey, again, this was from 2023, there are only 2 states that it's even 50% or just barely over the majority number. My home state of Texas on this map is 37, which I was frankly pretty surprised by because the policies of the state of Texas are so extreme, but they are against the majority of people, even in a conservative state like Texas. So again, that just shows this disconnect in the authoritarian or anti-democratic nature of the way that it's showing up in our society today. And so I want to talk next about some examples of Christian nationalism that we see. One of them on the next slide, I think one of the starkest examples was on January 6th, 2021, where the symbols of Christian nationalism and of Christianity were used in order to really justify the attack on the Capitol. That for many people there, it was not just a political cause, but a religious cause. That they thought that God had, again, anointed or installed Trump as president, that any election result that said that he did not win was therefore illegitimate, and that they were there on behalf of God to install Trump as president. That was an ideology that was very much fomented in the weeks leading up to January 6th, and it I believe, and researchers have looked into this, testified to Congress about it, really worked to intensify some of the violence. There were certainly violent actors there from some of the groups like the Proud Boys, but what turned other people who had just shown up to this, what made them kind of go into this, ultra-violent posture, and that Christian nationalism was at play there. I contrast that to the picture on the left, which is from a prayer vigil that was held across from the Capitol on January 6, 2023. To give an example that it's not, working to dismantle Christian nationalism is not about removing people of faith from the public square, but rather it's about bringing our faith to bear, not just Christianity, people from all faith traditions and none, bringing our identities to bear for advocacy in ways that don't seek to impose our religious views on everyone else through law and policy. And sometimes that's not a super clear line, but it's something that if we're engaged in faith-based advocacy, we really need to be attendant to and be sure that we're not furthering a version of religious nationalism in the advocacy that we're doing. The next slide talks a little bit about how Christian nationalism shows up in our churches. In our, I talked earlier about the ways that Christian nationalism has infected Christian theology and still exists in some of our theologies, in some of our worship practices, and some of the symbolism that we use. And so part, I think, of the work is for congregations to really ask themselves, how are we merging, in some cases, national and religious identities into one? Are we in some ways complicit in continuing this ideology? Are there places that we can do a better job of trying to separate our identities out? On the next slide, I want to talk about Christian nationalism in our schools. And this is a place that I want to concentrate on. There are lots of examples I could give about Christian nationalism. Maybe some of them will come up in the Q&A. But this is something that's really impacting communities across the country, and it's because there has been a concerted effort to push Christian nationalism in public schools. On the next slide, I want to give some examples. One of them is a teaching of a Christian nation mythology in schools in place of a more honest teaching of history. And we see that, for example, in a lot of curriculum that's being furthered. In my home, I'm going to use some examples out of Texas because that's what I'm most familiar with. But there's a new curriculum that is being pushed in Texas schools for kids from kindergarten to 5th grade. It's gotten some attention because it is reading curriculum, like reading and language arts curriculum, but it infuses the teaching of Bible stories into the curriculum. So it's like, we'll learn to read by reading Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, right? We'll learn, it's important for everyone here to understand these biblical references, and so we're going to teach Esther as a historical figure. These things that really are a misuse of Scripture, but also infringing on religious freedom. But not only do they do that, but they also replace an honest teaching of the history of religious freedom in this country with the Christian nation mythology. They overemphasize certain events from American history and make it seem as if America was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity and law and policy. Sometimes we see this by the kind of this tag word Judeo-Christian values. Okay, to be very obvious, there is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian religion. There's Christianity, there's Judaism. And to use Judeo as a modifier of Christianity is in fact a form of anti-Semitism, and it reduces and disrespects Judaism as its own form of religion. Not only that though, but it does so in a way that tries to give window dressing to being inclusive, right? This idea that, oh no, this isn't Christianity, this is Judeo-Christian. And some of the ways that we see this is, for instance, to try to justify as a policy the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms, with this false but often repeated claim that the Ten Commandments is the basis of all of American law, which is, there just is no support for that statement. Yes, the Ten Commandments are an important text for us to study and live by, both as Jews, also as Christians. We understand them differently from the two different traditions. Even Christian traditions have different ways of ordering and understanding the Ten Commandments. And what happens when the government first makes these false claims, that's furthering this mythology of America as a Christian nation, but they're also adopting one version of religion as the official religion. Here's, I think, the particularly ironic piece of the Ten Commandments. The version of the Ten Commandments that you all may know, Louisiana passed a law requiring its posting. That's under litigation right now. Several other states, including my home state of Texas, are expected to try to pass similar laws soon. The version that they've adopted as the official version is actually not found in anyone's Bible. It is an edited version of the King James Version of the Ten Commandments that was made popular at the time of the movie The Ten Commandments. And there was an effort to publicize the movie with the Fraternal Order of Eagles, that they took this edited version and put them on big monuments and put them all over the United States. So I call it the Charleston Heston version of the Ten Commandments, which is kind of appropriate. That's this Hollywood Americanization, version of religious text. And it is funny, but it is also debasing of the beauty of our religion and our religious texts. And so I think it's a really clear example of how even if that when government gets its hands on religion, it's religion that loses out. And that even if it's our religious tradition, there are reasons for us to oppose government endorsement of religion. So we see it not just in the posting of Ten Commandments, but also of In God We Trust, which is the national motto. It's been the national motto, though, just since the 1950s, when it was adopted at another time of high tide of Christian nationalism. Again, furthering this merger of American and Christian identities in ways that are exclusive, in ways that are misleading, but also would exclude people who don't have a religious belief, and especially in a public school context, where children are so vulnerable to exclusion already, that could be very harmful to them. And we also see it in content bans, bans like Don't Say Gay bills, but also book banning. And then school chaplains. This is something to watch out for. Texas became the first state back in 2023 to pass a law encouraging the hiring of school chaplains in public schools. high regard for chaplaincy in the right context, right? In contexts where people are not able to access religious guidance or religious clergy of their own. So we see it in military, in hospitals, in prisons. There are different examples. Public school, very different setting, right? Kids go home every night to their families and have an opportunity on the weekends when they don't have public school, when most traditions that's when they meet. And so there are ways for public school kids to get religion that aren't in the public schools. You might ask, well, what's a chaplain in the public school context? Well, the law in Texas defined a chaplain as anyone who can pass a criminal background check. So no like special training, no religious background, no evidence that you have any ability to work with children. In Texas, they even rejected an amendment that would have required parental consent. And there's also no limit on what the chaplain can say or do in these contexts, so no limit on proselytization. And the group that's behind these laws was very clear that their intent was proselytization. They were trying to convert children in public schools. But here's the good news. This law passed, again, didn't immediately go into effect, but it rather asked that school districts vote within the next 6 months on whether or not they would adopt a school chaplain program. And so my organization, along with a number of others, got involved in advocacy. We helped organize chaplains, people who were professional chaplains, to say that they did not agree that this was a good use of the chaplain program. So for the first time, many Texans even learned about this. It was headlines in their local paper that says, chaplains don't want school chaplains, right? And so we also help people go to their school boards. And at the end of the day, the vast majority of schools that even took a vote declined to expand the chaplain program. So we see, again, this disconnect between a really extreme policy passed on the state level and what the people on the ground, even in conservative areas of Texas, want and think is right for their people in their area. So I think that's an encouraging word and really a blueprint for how to oppose Christian nationalism in the public school context when it comes up in other places. So just a few more slides. What do we do about Christian nationalism? I'm not here just to, define the problem, but also think about what are some of the solutions. One of them is to join us at the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. And for people who are Christian, you have an opportunity to sign a statement of principles, unifying principles that are about religious freedom for all people. And so if you have not done that and would like to, you can find the statement on our website and add your name as a Christian against Christian nationalism. But people, regardless of religious identity, can access resources. On the next slide, we have a QR code that goes to our resource page. We're continually adding to this, open source, all free to download. We have a 3-part Sunday school curriculum that is meant for use in Christian communities to understand what the dangers of Christian nationalism are. We have podcast series with discussion guides, webinars with discussion guides. So lots of materials that not just individuals but groups can use to study and understand it. And then the next slide, the latest resource is the book that I wrote, How to End Christian Nationalism. And I wrote it, as the title suggests, for people who are concerned enough about a book about Christian nationalism to buy a book wanting to end it, but also who really need some practical ideas, that these, and so each chapter is organized as a step, and then at the end, discussion questions or ideas for action. And one of the actions that we really concentrate on is the need for local organizing against Christian nationalism. And we at Baptist Joint Committee, we started a pilot project where we hired a local organizer in North Texas. This was over a year ago, and so we have the experience of having worked on the ground in a place where there is quite a bit of Christian nationalism and quite a bit of policies that are furthered by it for us to oppose. On the next slide, some of the things that we've been doing in our local coalition. We have coalition meetings monthly that are places usually in person, sometimes virtual, for people to gather and for us to discern the work that we have to do. And we as a coalition have discerned working around public education, immigration, and church engagement as the 3 places that we most want to concentrate our efforts. One-on-ones, which are just kind of a core piece of organizing, of just having one-on-one conversations with people and expanding our coalition, bringing more and more people into our work. We've had a number of public events like speakers and film screenings, some public demonstrations, and quite a bit of advocacy training. So in addition to the chaplain work I talked about earlier, that curriculum, that reading curriculum, our coalition helped train people to read the curriculum, know how to file public comments, and then a number of us, we actually got a bus and we went down to Austin and testified before the State Board of Education. There were people on the other side, but the people who were concerned about it were outnumbering those at that meeting 4 to 1. And I don't know if you all are familiar with the advocacy group Moms for Liberty, but they're a group that has furthered a lot of these ideas. And this little anecdote, during one of the breaks, we overheard the Moms for Liberty. They said, "Who are all these people and where'd they come from? We've got to bring more people next time." And so that was a real sign, I think, of a win for us, that we were able to engage people and to come out and to speak from, we had a number of people who are Christian, but people who are Jewish and Muslim and atheists, who all say, for all these different reasons, we oppose the teaching of Bible stories in public schools, that public schools are not Sunday schools, that we have our religious institutions for teaching Bible, that public schools are for something else. And I wish I could say, we won the day, but what we did do, so the State Board of Education, very gerrymandered, very skewed, 10 Republicans, 5 Democrats. We got to the place where the vote was 8 to 7, and including 3 Republicans joined 4 Democrats. And you said, counting the heads, I thought you said 5 Democrats. Well, there was, but the 5th one had resigned to run for another office. And Governor Abbott appointed someone to that open Democratic seat who would vote on his behalf, and that's the only reason it passed. But just that we made it that close. And then the other good news is, again, just because they passed it doesn't mean it goes into effect. So now our coalition is going to local school districts and asking them to adopt a different curriculum and not this new curriculum that the state has endorsed. So on my last slide, I have a final QR code, and this is a QR code if anyone here is interested in doing some of this organizing work on a volunteer level here in this community or knows other people. We have someone on our team who is working with volunteer leaders on the ground to help equip them with ideas and materials and trainings to do this kind of organizing, but unique to your local context. And so would invite you, if you want to get engaged, to go there. So this is perfect. So we're coming to our Q&A.
I'm just going to use the microphone for the people at home.
Sure. BJC is Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty.
Say it again.
Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty.
Thank you so much. So before we convene downstairs for some lunch, just want to see if you have other questions, things that you would like to say, or questions for Amanda. We're going to use the microphone because, again, we are live streaming this and recording it, and so we want to make sure everybody can hear. So I think they're all soaking it in.
Question for you, Stacy.
Oh.
Would you send something out, an email? You can send it to me. You can send it to anyone else that's interested. To information. I want her bio. If you can do the sermon and
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you have this. I love all the information.
The slides.
I
We
was-
can provide the slides. We can provide this.
Yeah.
I'll do a PDF
Yeah.
of the slides
Yeah.
and the sermon manuscript and the link to engage here in case
Yeah.
you don't have
Yeah, I
your phone or
wasn't-
able to do that.
taking notes
Taking-
or doing it.
No,
in
I'm
depth,
glad
but I
that you
would
were
like to-
enjoying. Yeah, no, totally. I think we can get that.
Happy to.
And I know colleagues, too, would like that information.
That'd be
So,
great.
thank you. Oh, gosh. Okay, Billy, and then we'll go to...
So I'm sitting here thinking, why
why the fight against Christian nationalism? What's the goal in the end? And I think I could answer that question, but I'm just rolling that in my mind. But while I roll that along, I wanted to share that for the past now 7 years, I have been part of a book group that reads only literature written by African Americans. We call ourselves the African American Literature Book Club, which came out of the downtown Hartford Public Library. We continue on Zoom, and everybody and anybody can join. And during these 7 years, all the reading I've done has at least partly, if not largely, shocked me at how little I knew about the experience of being a person of color in this country. There are shades of color. We still live with the, what my understanding is that we still live with the results of slavery, which went on for so long. The reason I did not know as much as I now know is because it wasn't taught in the schools. So we have a whitewash of education, at least that I experienced. I'm in my 70s, so hopefully things have changed. But at any rate, I just wanted to make that remark.
Yeah,
Which leads to answering the question of why we need.
Yeah, I was going back to that because yes.
Thank you, Billy.
So, yeah, so I would say the way that we first got engaged in this work, was because we saw, again, we, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, saw Christian nationalism as an urgent threat to religious freedom in this country. And so seeing the need to work to dismantle it in order to protect religious freedom. But you ask like a really important question. We're not just trying to do away with something. We're trying to help build a society that has never existed before, and that is a fully multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, pluralistic democracy. That promise has never been fully fulfilled. And then I think as we answer that question, I think Christians and other people of faith are also, it's not just the limits of a political system, but how do we build the beloved community? How do we bring God's kingdom to earth as it is in heaven as we pray each week? And that answering that question is really the kind of society where everyone is valued, where we have an end to discrimination, an end to poverty, an end to oppression. Like that's really what I think the long-term goal is. And we identify Christian nationalism, white supremacy as an obstacle to that kind of full inclusion. And you're, the whitewashing, the racism, the white supremacy, it permeates in the books we read, in what's taught in schools. I keep harping on this curriculum out of Texas, but another piece they have is the way they teach history. When they talk about Washington and Jefferson in this history, I read these lessons that they're teaching to like first graders and second graders, and they say Washington and Jefferson knew that slavery was wrong, and they never say that they themselves owned people in human bondage. They don't even teach that they had plantations, right? The way that they start when they talk about slavery was with the Civil War, as if it just happened, right? That slavery just happened during the Civil War. So that's that kind of mythology, right? That's part of this Christian nation mythology that is being continued. It's not just a problem from when you were in public school. It's something that's actually expanding, I think, in this time when, we see it in policies to do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion instruction and offices. Again, not just on the federal level, but the state of Texas, last year had already outlawed. So at public universities in Texas, everyone who worked with anything about DEI in their title was fired immediately, and all those programs were shut down. So it's part of this larger web of policies that's perpetuating racism under the guise of Christianity.
Carolyn, did you have a question?
Well, I was just thinking about the school systems that you had talked to. I mean, there's purse strings that are involved in all of that. So they would be losing probably a lot of state funding if they didn't adopt these mandated programs?
Yeah, so very astute question. So basically, well, one, public schools in Texas and in a lot of other jurisdictions are very underfunded, and that's a strategy in order for them not to succeed so they can be replaced with private schools that would then get the government funding. So that's kind of this overall strategy in a lot of jurisdictions in the country. And so they are underfunded, and the way this curriculum is set up is there is a financial incentive that it's not that they would have money taken from them from their budgets, but there's a financial incentive if they adopt this curriculum over others. And it's, I think, $60 per student, which in a school, I mean, that can mean a meaningful amount of money when they're already underfunded. It also creates a political problem. If they say no to it, then it gets translated into your leaders turned away state funding, right? So it's very cynical the way all of this is set up. And so that was why we tried so hard to reject the curriculum. I will say all of those public comments made a difference in that they did fix the most egregious errors in the curriculum. So I will give you one example. I mentioned that Esther is taught at length in this curriculum, which is very curious for a number of different reasons. In the original version, they did identify Esther as a historical figure, although there is actually no evidence that Esther actually existed. I think they corrected that. But something else they had in the original curriculum is, you know, for little kids, you have a learning activity, you have a lesson, and then you have a learning activity. And the learning activity that they had, and I might have the rabbi kind of explain how egregious this is, but they had them rolling dice and casting lots, which in the book of Esther meant to decide, I think, who would be killed in the genocide and when the genocide would happen. So they are actually having kids play about genocide. Now, I don't think they knew that's what they were doing, but they had a lot of people, particularly from the Jewish community, to come and explain how anti-Semitic this curriculum was. And so in the final version, they took out the dice playing game. But that's why advocacy matters, right? That it mattered for people who do understand these sacred texts to come and explain to people why they were misrepresenting them. Another example, not from religious tradition, but this Christian nation mythology, they had this lesson, again, this cherry-picked history about the Liberty Bell. And they pointed out there's a Bible verse on the Liberty Bell. And they told this story about how the founders put that on there in order to celebrate their freedom from England and the Declaration of Independence and how important this verse was to them. Only problem is that bell was cast and the inscription put in 1750, before the independence, right? So they make up history in order to justify this Christian nation mythology. They took that out in the final curriculum, so the kids will not be learning somehow that people in 1750 were celebrating the Declaration of Independence. So the advocacy matters, but it is difficult with the way that funding is set up. But.
Hang on,
You want to?
just a second. Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
It's interesting because the founder set that up for separation of church and state. And the reason that people came to this country and took the land of the native folks was because they wanted religious freedom. They didn't want to be trapped in a authoritarian type of situation as what was happening in Great Britain. So it's just, I feel like part of the whole thing is educating people on our history as a country and where we got, how we got to where we are. That course needs to be corrected.
Yeah, for sure. And, no mention of separation of church and state in the curriculum at all. And when we talked about religious freedom, they did elevate the idea of the Massachusetts Bay Colony as this haven of religious freedom, which we know it was not, right? You know,
Not
yes,
if you were Baptist.
they
Not if
were
you were Jewish,
escaping.
not if you
They were
were-
escaping, you know, religious persecution, and as soon as they came here, they started persecuting people within the colony. So, you know, that is important history for people to understand. It is not a mythology. It is not a, you know, this glorious history, right? These are people. Failings, you know, successes and failings, and we need to learn both if we're actually going to have a full understanding of history. There's a question here, and then we'll up here.
When we talk about teaching religion in school, the word religion can be broken down into many things. And I understand teaching faith in public schools is not something we should be doing. But we should always be teaching history of religion, the sociology of religion, the poetry of religion, and all of this kind of thing that you have to consider. So don't just talk about religion as a word that means only one thing. So that's...
Yeah, that's a very important point that I did gloss over. Part of the main problem with this curriculum was that it wasn't age appropriate. So we do teach, I think religious literacy is very important, not just Christian religious literacy, but other faiths as well, if we are going to be producing people to live well in a pluralistic democracy like we have. Also, understanding literature and art, there are a number of religious allusions, right? And we can teach context, but usually those things are taught at the secondary level. They're not taught to kindergarten through 5th grade, and that's because, as we know, I mean, we have these, you know, adorable children up here. It's very difficult to tell the difference between like a faith claim and something you're being taught as fact. And so when you're teaching faith claims, which is what are in these Bible verses, to kids who have a hard time telling the difference, they're hearing that as fact from one of the most important authority figures in their life, and that's their elementary school teacher. And that pedagogy is interfering with their religious freedom and the religious freedom of their families who are choosing how and when to expose their kids to faith. But it is not meant, and that I'm so glad you made that point, that we're not scrubbing religion out of public school curriculum, but we have to do it in age-appropriate ways and ways that are relevant to the context, which was not present and is still not present in this particular curriculum.
Thank you.
I did have a question that earlier in your talk you mentioned the forming of the Baptist Joint Committee and all the different Baptist denominations that joined together, including Southern Baptists. And I wonder, what is their participation? Because and maybe I'm wrong, but I think of them as being a lot of backers of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, a great question. I didn't come back to that. So you all know enough about Baptists that we're kind of an unruly lot, right? And we can choose to associate and disassociate in different ways. So the Southern Baptist Convention as an organization actually ceased to be part of Baptist Joint Committee in the early 1990s. And it was over some of the advocacy that BJC was doing, particularly around, what I believe core of the Baptist distinctive of religious freedom and the work that we continue to do is being separationist, is this idea of not having established religion, speaking out against the establishment of religion. The Southern Baptist Convention is not as separationist as BJC is, and frankly not as separationist as I think they once were. And so we've seen some differences. But because of the way Baptists are, we still have some Southern Baptist churches, some individuals who are Southern Baptists who continue to support the work, because a convention doesn't speak on behalf of all Baptists, or should not in Baptist polity. And so, yeah, they're no longer an official part. But there are a number of different, I think we're now at about a dozen different Baptist denominational bodies that support BJC. And, you know, I say, they don't agree on everything, or there wouldn't be a dozen of them, but they all agree on the importance of religious freedom for all. And I think that joint nature of our voice is really important to the work we continue to do.
Was there a question over here? Did I see a hand? Carol, Juanita? No? Juanita? Okay.
Can you tell me the name of your book, please?
Yes, it's called How to End Christian Nationalism.
Oh, your question. Sorry.
My other question was if do you think they have, Library of Congress has a Braille copy of that?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I don't know. I do know there's an audio book.
There is an audio book.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
But I will ask.
There you go. Oh, Mel. You guys have a lot of questions. There's lunch waiting for you downstairs.
This is not a question, it's just a comment. People have to be aware of the fact that under the Constitution, there is no mandate that directs anything from the federal government in regards to funding for education. Education is not mentioned at all. So that reverts back to the states, but the Federal Department of Education controls a lot of what happens in schools directly with its funding. It has no mandate, but through the federal dollars that it gives to states, to school districts, that's how they control what happens. But it doesn't, there is no mandate in regards to
free
to
public
funding or in regards to any policies that they establish.
Yeah, good point, Mel. Anybody else? Oh, Darwin.
Yeah, your statistic about Texas seeming to be a little lower in the incidence or the adherence to Christian nationalism than you might expect, because is due in part to the great control that the Texas government has and holds on to extremely tightly. And so, you know, that's one of the problems that you alluded to about while a minority can control a majority. And the desire for minority control of government, at least as a clear tactic, was not dependent upon Christian nationalism.
That's right.
And so, but it uses it as a useful tool. It exploits that as an additional measure to achieve power or maintain power. So you know, there's still the issue of wanting to consolidate power, but it's the Christian nationalism is kind of riding that wave, and so getting rid or educating people on Christian nationalism, we still run up against that desire to consolidate power and take power away from minorities.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think I know more about the Texas example than others because I live there and have experienced that. I will say I would recommend, there's an article that came out last fall. It was published by a ProPublica author journalist, but it was published in the New York Times Magazine, and it was about how 2 billionaires have basically bought the state government of Texas. And what's so interesting is they are very motivated by Christian nationalism in their work. So it is writing it, but it is also driving it in the particular way that it's showing up in Texas now. I also think, not unique to Texas, but another anti-democratic, small d democratic, institution in this country is political gerrymandering. And that's true but for both parties, right? But the idea that our elected representatives are not truly representative of the people because the representatives are picking their districts rather than the people picking their representatives. In the Supreme Court, I mean, political gerrymandering has been ruled to be constitutional, right? But this is also my big point is, just because something has been ruled to be constitutional does not make it a good idea and does not make it something that furthers democracy. And so in places like Texas and a lot of other places, there are fewer and fewer ways for the people to actually express their view. In Texas, there is no ballot referenda opportunity where people, like in a lot of states, I don't know about Connecticut, but if you can put something up for a majority vote for people, there's no such option in a state in Texas. And so you've got a legislature that is so far extreme that is not representing, again, a majority of Texans, even conservative Texans, right? That it's just gotten so extreme. And so there are a lot of different problems, and it's not, so just working only on Christian nationalism isn't going to solve all of these issues, but I think it helps us understand the impact.
Thank you. Deborah.
First, thank you for your presentation. It was really great, and thank you for making the slides and your sermon available to us. I have a question, but I just want to note that of all the books in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Esther is the only one that never mentions God. Exactly. So I find it ironic in the extreme that they're like so obsessed with Esther. Also, it's not a true story. It's, whatever. Okay. So my question is about, often I feel like, oh, thank God I'm in Connecticut. and say not in Texas, or certain other states. But what I've heard is, and what I've read, is that Texas is responsible because of the way that the business of school curricula and school textbooks, because that business is centralized in Texas. It's not just that it's centralized in Texas, it's that Texas is it's a big state and it's a huge market. So, so school textbook publishers will gear their books toward being acceptable in Texas, and then that's what's available for everybody. And so we could be in Connecticut or some other lovely bluish state, and the textbooks are influenced by what's gonna fly in Texas.
That's very true, and we've seen that over the years with all kinds of different culture war, like long before our current situation. How this particular curriculum decision plays out is a little unsure, because for the first time, and this is different, this is a state-owned curriculum. The state developed this curriculum rather than a private publisher. So private publishers were also against this curriculum because they stand to lose a ton of business if school districts take the financial incentive and buy this state-developed curriculum over that. So then what's the domino effect for publishing if that happens? And I think that's somewhat unknown, right? Because we also, the new curriculum, even if schools adopted it, would not go into effect until the next school year. So we still don't know exactly how this is all going to play out.
Thank you.
Thank
you all. Yes, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Anyone, if you would like that information for me to send it to you, just let me know. We'll make a list. Everything's all set up downstairs for lunch. So I welcome you to join us downstairs, and Amanda's going to be joining us as well. So sit at her table and have wonderful conversation. The subtleties of this, we're just thank you so much for exposing that for us today, because there's a lot. There's a lot. So quick blessing for our meal. I'd be happy to do that before we head downstairs. Gracious and loving God, first and foremost, we give you thanks for the gift of this day, the blessing and opportunity to gather together in this place, to learn, to grow, to be challenged by you and by your word. May you bless our meal and our conversation always in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. See you all downstairs.